Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at those 5 key themes of Gothic literature that are also going to inform our understanding of monsters and their sociological purposes, and the way in which cultures have conceived of them to represent some of their deepest either sociological fears or personal ones. The first of these major themes is the fear of otherness. Undergirding many of these Gothic texts, and embodied or instantiated, made manifest in the form of the monsters that we create, is often the fear of otherness, a concern about the delineation between ourselves and something that is outside of ourselves. We structure our civilizations, our societies, and our conceptual spheres that allow us to understand the world in such a way as to necessitate the exclusion of certain kinds of people. Now, this fear of otherness, as is indicated in the article that I asked you to read, or the supplemental text that you're reading here, is largely an ethnic or xenophobic concern about otherness. In one of the most famous novels of the weird or of the Gothic literature, Dracula, Dracula is this pervasive, invasive force that threatens to subvert and corrupt the blood of innocent English maidens. So you have England, this pure bastion of, evolved civilization. And then you have Dracula, this Eastern European foreigner who carries with him a disease of the blood, some kind of bizarre degenerative infection that is threatening to enter into England. And much of the novel is oriented around Dracula's attempt to enter into and corrupt English society. He is unable to cross the ocean without being confined in this powerless state inside of a coffin. So that portion of the novel is about him entering into the country and trying to despoil it, corrupt it, and infect it. That fear of difference, that fear of otherness, of invasion, and the need to create this bastion or borderline around our sphere of the known, the protected, the safe, in order to keep out those forces, is at the heart of the monsters that many civilizations create. It's not just European culture, Western culture, or England. It's a universal theme that we see in Gothic literature, but in monsters more generally, as this invasive force that's threatening to undermine the bastion of order, life, light, and sanity that we have in our world. The second major theme in Gothic literature, and the second major impulse or inclination that is embodied in the monsters that we tend to create, is the return of the repressed. In this view, human beings are constantly attempting to repress the darker sides of themselves, impulses and inclinations that we can't share with the world, or that civilization and society have told us we must keep in check in order to actually participate in that civilization. In contrast with that first major theme, where the destructive, invasive force is external, in The Return of the Repressed, we see that within the civilization itself, and within the citizens of that civilization, the inclinations and desires that could undo it are actually roiling up inside of the people. In one of the other most famous works of Gothic literature or of monster making, we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is ultimately a man who is concerned with the welfare of civilization, the care of his fellow citizens, and the like. However, he drinks a concoction of his own devising that brings to the surface all the dark animalistic impulses that he has repressed through his beneficent impulses. Dr. Jekyll then transforms through the use of this potion into Mr. Hyde, this deformed, hideous, animalistic, powerful creature that is embodiment of all the darkness within him. And it's in fact an upwelling of all those things that he has repressed, sensual and destructive. This animalistic creature that bubbles up from within is the return of the repressed. It is all those forces and structures that civilization tells us we cannot express in our lives, and so we repress them. That monster that lives within all of us, those darker impulses, is the thing that then comes to the surface in these monster stories. And oftentimes the monsters themselves are embodiments of those impulses. Now, that revelation may not be physical, as in Dr. Jekyll. It can be psychological, that in a tale like The Telltale Heart, murderous impulses, manic tendencies, madness, insanity, or psychopathy can bubble up to the surface. So we may have a fundamentally human being who's not externally a monster, but those impulses that we try to repress and that we say are antisocial do come to the forefront. In relation to that, we have this concept of colloquially what we would term monsters are us, that the nature of the beast is inside of us. Western civilization prides itself predominantly on its rationalism. Horror delves into the hidden irrationality and savagery that we seek to conceal and to deny with our pretenses about civility and civilization. The explosion of desires, hungers, and embedded animalistic longings that we believe we've outgrown help to define the genre of horror and the monsters that we create. Classically, prior to the 1800s, monsters were often figured as an inhuman foil or adversary to overcome. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but as a trend in the depiction of monsters, these were not particularly infused with character or humanity. They weren't people to be considered. They were objects or obstacles for people to overcome. Largely, as the concepts of monsters and the depiction of monsters in literature and myth have evolved over time, the monstrous nature of these creatures and their internality becomes the object of focus. We begin to actually interrogate and psychologically analyze monsters. You need only think of the surfeit of different texts regarding humanoid monsters, that is, the depiction of psychopathy in literature, like with Hannibal, wherein the psychopath or the monster, the human monster, quote unquote, has become the locus of our stories, not necessarily the protagonist, but the villain protagonist, perhaps, of these works as we delve into the mindset of one of these people or one of these creatures if we're dealing with a real monster. In this course, we're going to be looking at the classical Anglo-Saxon text of Beowulf, at least excerpts thereof, in week 3. That story was rewritten, the story about a monster in the ancient English world that attacks a mead hall. This story was rewritten in a novel by John Gardner entitled Grendel. Now, Beowulf is a story all about the hero, Beowulf, who overcomes the monster Grendel. And Grendel doesn't have too many concrete motivations. We don't delve into his mind. However, in the novel, that novel itself is entirely oriented around Grendel. You have the shift from the hero, Beowulf, to the novel, Grendel. Because in our popular conception of monsters, we've suddenly moved away from the hero and the monster just being an obstacle for him to overcome, to the monster being the locus of value and interest. So this novel is a protracted psychological and character analysis of the creature, the monster Grendel, that's relegated to the status of an object for Beowulf to kill and overcome in the poem. That is a representation or a reflection of the trend in the depiction of monsters. Monsters have become a symbolic reflection of ourselves, our anxieties, and the loathsome elements that we see in our own natures. Killing the monster, then, is not just an ability to overcome some external threat. It becomes a symbolic reflection of our ability to grapple with and destroy the elements of our own natures that we wish to overcome. It provides us with a satisfaction, not just of overcoming that external threat that's seeking to either destroy us or to enter into our land, as in that idea of the monster as this creature entering into our little bastion of civilization, the monster as other, but the monster as ourselves, the monster as an aspect of ourselves that we can destroy, that we can overcome, because it is the worst that we see in ourselves. The next major theme and the next defining aspect of many monsters is the fear of historical reversal. Oftentimes, horror stories are concerned with the idea that our civilization is balanced on a knife's edge, and that if we were simply surrender to any of those animalistic impulses that define us individually or that we repress, or if we allow those creatures from outside, the other, to enter into our civilization, they may overcome and destroy us. Thus, there may be this process of historical reversal, whereby our civilization, which is essentially at its peak, may revert back into this animalistic state of savagery, tyranny, and superstition. So the concerns over superstitious beliefs and a distrust regarding tyranny or those negative impulses might undermine civilization and hurtle us back into the dark ages of repression and destructive myth. The last major defining theme of Gothic literature, and the last major theme that helps to define monsters that we'll be exploring in relation to this supplemental text, is the history of madness. Michel Foucault said this: "We have yet to write the history of that other form of madness by which men and women, in an act of sovereign reason, confine their neighbors and communicate and recognize each other through the merciless language of non-madness." One of the things that monsters often tend to allow us to do is to explore the concept of madness and to return perhaps to an ancient understanding of the nature of madness and its interplay with reason. That idea of civilization's rationality or Western civilization's evolution away from folly into reason, the light of reason, scientific empirical understandings of the universe and the like, is at odds with the depiction of the figure of the fool in classic literature. In Shakespeare's plays, for instance, the fool is often the locus of wisdom. He is given a license to speak truths that other characters who are constrained by social convention cannot, because they're too afraid of their own position, or too afraid of being judged, or of being censored, or feeling reprisal. The fool has license to point out the flaws in civilization, or to mock other characters who need deflation. So, the madness or the folly of the fool is a powerful curative element that balances the restrained reason in these texts and in these civilizations. The fool, in a sense, is a guardian of truth. As it says in that supplemental article that I posted in the Distributed Documents tab that we're looking at here, at this time, that is, during the medieval period, mad people were not generally interned. They were often expelled from the city itself, but allowed to wander freely over the countryside. To prevent their return, they were often entrusted to groups of merchants and pilgrims, who then deposited them at a safe distance from the place of origin. These practices associated with their departure and embarkation suggest rituals of exclusion. So there's a desire to excise the fool from civilization, but there's also a recognition of the interplay, not necessarily the balance, but the necessary relationship and conversation between folly and wisdom, the fool and the rational. So in these stories, or in stories about monsters, you have an exploration of the best way to grapple with, to understand, and put into communication with reason madness, and an articulation of folly or madness that our civilization has tended to eschew. Now, in that second article by Stephen King on why we crave horror movies, King establishes several key principles about the appeal of horror narratives, of our enduring fascination with monsters. Now, one of the questions that the ancient philosopher and essentially what we would consider a literary critic in some ways, Aristotle, posed about tragedy was, why do people go into a tragedy, a work that they know is going to end poorly, and desire to experience negative emotions? You know that if tragedy is good, it's only going to make you feel depressed and sad, so why do you crave that experience? Stephen King offers a similar kind of question. Why do we go to horror movies when we know we're just going to be frightened by them? Now, he posits a few individual sort of psychological answers regarding the evolution of the nature of the human mind, and also sociological functions of horror movies. The first reason, he says, that many of us go into horror movies is that we have a kind of daredevil impulse. Why? Some of the reasons are simple and obvious, to show that we can, that we're not afraid, that we can ride this roller coaster. The second reason is simply to have fun, that there's something enjoyable about pretending to be scared. The horror film also allows us to exercise those darker impulses within ourselves. All of us, King asserts, have some degree of insanity or madness. All of us have anti-civilizational impulses, things that we want that society tells us are wrong. Entering into a horror movie to see these spectacles of controlled, safe depravity, or to see people breaking free from those constraints, for instance, through things that are as taboo and horrifying and disgusting as, those grisly axe murders or even cannibalism, allows us to exercise those demons, to give them a place to play, or to satiate those desires that we can never articulate. Even if they're not, cannibalism, there's still something anti-civilizational, something that runs counter to the structures that civilization have imposed upon us. Because, as he says, the potential lyncher is in almost all of us, and every now and again he has to be let loose to scream and roll about in the grass. Horror movies, horror literature, and the depiction of monsters that we see therein allows us to have that safe exercise of our own demons, or our own potential lynchers. Horror movies, he says, and indeed horror narratives generally, have a strangely conservative impulse. Even though they seem to be the most liberal and grotesque of entertainment because they are challenging social norms and taboos, they're breaking free of them in some way, horror movies also involve the reimposition of norms by way of the defeat of the creature. Horror movies allow us, in essence, to have our cake and eat it too, in that they are normative. They reestablish our sense that we are normal because we participate, in King's words, in a freak show of horror. We see those worst excesses of depravity and ugliness. We get that visceral taboo thrill of experiencing them. But then we leave the theater and we confine it to the realm of fiction to distance ourselves from those things and to say, no, I'm not actually like that. I may have those impulses, but I restrain them. Obviously, not the impulses towards cannibalism, but those impulses towards the taboo, even in small ways. And it allows us to feel as if we are normal because we are. It's reimposed. And there's also a kind of psychological and conservative element to this work. Because we're able to reimpose those norms on leaving the theater, suddenly the structures of civilization are reinforced. We've had them challenged and threatened by those hideous creatures within the film. But then that hideous creature is destroyed. The threat to civilization, the threat to our society, the threat to our norms and our values, our morals, is cast out. Frankenstein's monster is left adrift in the Arctic, destroyed. So, these are some of the major impulses that undergird the fascination with horror films and horror narratives more generally and monsters, and also some of the major themes that underlie monsters and what they tend to represent civilizationally and personally. Keep these things in mind as we move on into Noel Carroll's work on the philosophy of horror that delves into these concepts in even more depth.